You can have a beautiful garden of perennial herbs such as Echinacea, lavender, nepetella, parsley, and sage. Jeff Mason of Mason House Gardens has created gorgeous gardens with plants that look good and are good to use. Welcome to Richters Seminars. This video presentation is from a series of free educational seminars on herb and garden topics offered each year at Richters.
So I don't really come at perennials from a herbal standpoint. I've always been more of ornamental gardening. We have for the last 10 years or so, though, gotten a lot more into edible gardening in general, and heirloom vegetables and things like that. But we primarily have been involved with unusual plants, ornamental plants, whether they're tropical or perennial. And when Janine asked me to do the talk, I had sort of thought about one that we had sort of branched off. We do a lot of talks. My mother is a well-known speaker, and she does a lot of talks on the potager and the attractive vegetable garden. She's going to be here in a couple of weeks, 3 weeks or so. She'll be here doing that one. So you'll want to be sure you're back for that. But what really got me thinking about this topic was I've been doing some work now with a landscape design build firm in Toronto, and a garden that we worked on this past year. The clients had a real interest in cooking and things like that, and the garden consisted of an outdoor kitchen and perennial gardens and things like that. And it was a beautiful large garden. And when she got down to sort of the last bit of nitty gritty, she says, she wanted to have a herb garden. Well, she left this little 6 foot by 8 foot wedge of this massive backyard for herbs, and that was it. And, I think it's terrible that herbs, like vegetables, often just get shoved to the back corner of the garden because you're just going to use them for what you want them for. But there are a lot of herbal plants that really look good and should be front and center in your garden because they're wonderful to look at, and then you can use them as you need them. They're going to do double duty for you. They're going to be great ornamentals, and then you can eat them. I think that sort of trend is becoming very popular, especially with a lot of younger people who are thinking, great plant, looks nice, what else is it going to do for me? And if you can have a plant in a garden, especially if you have limited space, that's going to look good, come back year after year, and oh yeah, you can eat it too, perfect. So that's what we're going to look at today. There will be a few medicinal type herbs in there because there's a few we can't do without, but largely we're going to sort of be leaning towards culinary type plants that can be used in cooking and things like that. So right off the start, we're looking at the yarrows. Yarrows are primarily used as medicinal herbs, but they're fantastic in the perennial garden, especially if you've got hot, dry, sunny conditions. We garden. Anybody garden sort of in this immediate area up here? You know what a soil's like. It's sand, and it's not sand, it's rocks. And it is dry. This year, I hope we get rain this spring, because with the minimal amount of snow we have, it could be a really dry year for us up here. So the xeriscaping and the drought-tolerant gardening has always been a big focus for us as well. And the yarrows are great for that. They love it hot and dry, and in fact, they really want that well-drained, dry conditions. If you grow perennials like yarrows in rich, fluffy garden soil, they get rangy, they flop all over the place, they're kind of crummy plants. But when you starve them, they're fantastic. And they work really well in the garden. The one thing, though, with the yarrows I find that is, if you don't dig them up every 2 or 3 years, tear them apart and replant them, they start to disappear. We've had wonderful clumps over the years that we think, boy, it's looking great, it's looking great. We look at it the next year and 90% of it died away over the winter. So it's one of those perennials. It's a little bit more work, but it's wonderful for flower color. It's white, yellows, reds, pinks, oranges, lots of good color range. One of my favorite perennials, especially for the dry soil that we have up here, is Agastache, or Anise hyssop. The species is native to Canada. It's a native prairie plant. The beauty of it for us is that once it starts blooming with these wonderful spikes of blue flowers, usually about late spring, early summer, it does not stop until the end of the season. It will bloom right through the summer. There aren't a lot of perennials that will bloom all summer long like that, but the Agastaches will. The one on the slide here is one called Black Adder, and there's been a lot of hybridizing done with them. So with our Agastache funiculum, which is our native Anise hyssop, some of the European species are mixed in, and we're getting really wonderful garden plants that have a wonderful licoricey, minty sort of fragrance. The leaves are also, have that flavor and can be used. And if you're a bee person and a pollinator person, these are a fantastic plant for honeybees and pollinators in the garden. They have lots of nectar and are terrific for that. Now, there it is there with Helenium or sneezeweed. It's a little hard to see there, but it's a wonderful, nice, spiky flowers. Blends well with things like the yarrows or any of the summer daisies that we have lots of in the garden. Now, there are a lot of Agastaches out there now. It's a very popular group of plants, and you're going to start seeing them in all sorts of different colors. Wonderful strains like the Kudos series, and this is Kudos Mandarin, which is a wonderful orange flower color. The foliage is wonderfully fragrant, smells kind of like spicy root beer. It's gorgeous. Blooms all summer. Only problem, though, with some of these Agastaches that you're going to find, especially in the oranges and reds, is that they're not quite winter hardy for us. Okay. They're going to be sold probably as annuals most of the time, and if they overwinter for you, it's a bonus. But I don't want you to think that that's not a reason to use them, because again, they will flower continuously until frost. So they're wonderful that way. But they just may not overwinter. The blue ones, Black Adder, Blue Fortune, varieties like that, they're much hardier and more reliably perennial. Another medicinal one, but one of my favorites for massing and edging, this Alchemilla mollis, Lady's Mantle. Has a wonderful gray foliage, and when water falls on it, it beads up like little diamonds. It's really wonderful. And then a froth of these chartreuse flowers. It'll grow in the sun, it'll grow in the shade, it'll grow in the moist and dry. Can get a little rambunctious in some gardens with seeding, but it's a great edging plant and filler plant for around the base of taller perennials. Plants like that, I was at a great talk just this past week at the Toronto Botanical Garden, and the speaker, Thomas Rainier, is describing sort of new ideas in perennial plantings, and one of the ideas that he was talking about was having layers in the perennial garden. And we don't often think about this, we put in our big showy plants, we put in our filler plants, we sometimes have some edging plants. But what he's talking about with these edging plants is actually using them as the ground cover or the mulch layer. We always go out and buy lots of bags of mulch and things and cover the bare soil with mulch. And then you have to keep doing that and keep doing that. But what he's talking about and recommending now is using these low ground covery type plants as a living mulch. Covering open ground with these creeping plants. That way you don't need to buy mulch, you don't need to add mulch, and that ground cover layer keeps weeds down through your perennial borders. Some of them would take walking on, but just as a filler right through the whole garden. So not keeping these creeping plants just along the edges, but using them at the base of all the bigger perennials through the garden. One plant that I think is fantastic, and I remember as a kid, it was always just relegated to, some little out-of-the-way corner of the garden underneath the rain spout where it just was there when you needed it, was chives. And chives is actually a fantastically ornamental plant. Beautiful flowers, very easygoing, super drought tolerant. You cannot kill chives. And what I didn't realize actually until this winter was that chives is actually a native Ontario perennial. It grows well up around the northern parts of Ontario, Hudson Bay area, that kind of thing. Extremely hardy, very easygoing, and a great a herb to use the leaves or the flowers. So this picture was from, I think it was Wisley Garden in England, but our hot sunny garden is going to get a good sweep of chives in it this year. This is a particular variety that I like. It's called a four-skate. This is the giant pink chives. So your typical chives have a lavender flower. Four-skate is larger, up to about 18 inches or so, with large heads of bright pink flowers. And another relative that sometimes people curse a little bit, but I just love, is the Allium tuberosum, or the garlic chives. Garlic chives has white flowers in the late summer. Very garlicky flavor to the chives, but extremely showy when it blooms. The only thing you need to be careful of is that it can seed itself a little too much. So you need to just deadhead it once the flowers are finished. But enjoy it while it's blooming. It makes a great late summer border plant. Now, milkweed's not really a culinary herb at all, but milkweeds are very popular these days, and everywhere we turn, you're hearing plant milkweeds, plant milkweeds, plant milkweeds for the monarchs. And it kind of worries me a little bit, because I'm worried that if people don't realize what regular milkweed will do in the garden, that they might be very sorry that they bothered to help the monarchs. Milkweed is a bit of a weed, and it's very persistent, and if it gets into your perennial borders and through your gardens, you will never, ever get it out, and it can be a little nasty. It's beautiful. This is a plant growing on the edge of our garden. Last summer, it has those great fluffy seed pods in the fall. But it is a bit of a thug. So if you're going to grow it, put it out along the fence lines, put it out in some open field, grow it in the ditch, but don't put the regular milkweed in the garden. Much better, look at some of the other perennial milkweeds. Asclepias tuberosa, the butterfly weed with the brilliant orange flowers, grows really well in our dry, sandy soil. Heavy, wet clay, very rich garden soil, not great for it. It likes to be starved, and it likes to have the drainage. But as you can, so I hope you can see them there. There is a nice monarch sitting right on top of that. That was out of our garden a couple of years ago. And we grow this right out in the full sun, hot, dry, unirrigated garden. If you've got a bit heavier soil, yeah?
Why do you suggest to not mix it in with your regular garden?
The regular milkweed?
Yeah.
Regular milkweed runs underground. And it has roots that will just travel everywhere underground and pop up wherever it feels like. So it can be a little bit annoying in the general garden sense. Great as a ditch plant. The Asclepias tuberosa, the orange butterfly weed, stays put. As well, if you have heavier soils or more moisture, then look at the swamp milkweed. It's a beautiful plant with one of the worst common names you could ever give to a plant to make it appealing to anybody. But swamp milkweed, Asclepias incarnata, is actually a wonderful, long-lived, perennial, clump-forming, so it doesn't run. It gets about 3 to 4 feet tall, has deep pink flowers. You can see the monarch right on there. You can also get a white flowered form, but they stay put. There's the white flowered form there in a mix with Echinaceas, Monardas, Nepettellas in the garden. It's a wonderful mingling type plant, very easy going, and it won't take over the garden. Yeah? You know what? I don't know. The monarchs certainly go to them for nectar at least. I've never noticed larvae on them in our garden, but that doesn't mean that they don't go on to that. Do they, John? Will they eat them? Yeah, because I haven't seen them do that in our garden so much. Swamp milkweed for us is not a really long-lived plant in our garden. primarily because it's very dry. You know, do they devour your swamp milkweed? Perfect. Okay. Well, that's okay. That's what it's there for. It's Asclepias tuberosa. Orange butterfly weed. That you'll find it. Absolutely. Yeah. I could, but anyway, yeah. So those are a couple of the milkweed family to use. You know, they're much better as garden plants than regular milkweed. Another plant that I really, really like, and we never see it again used as a garden plant very often, is asparagus. Asparagus makes a beautiful, big, ferny plant. And, you know, often you see it relegated to the back corner of the yard. But this is a shot from a garden in Pennsylvania called Chanticleer. And they have it on the border of their vegetable garden. And when I saw that planting, I thought, you know, what a great backdrop that would be to a herbaceous perennial garden. When it comes up in the spring, you can harvest a whole bunch of it and then let it grow, and it'll give you that nice, wonderful, ferny, filmy, green backdrop to a perennial border without having to need a special spot for it in the garden. I never thought that just had occurred to me the other day. Actually, when I was putting this together, because a lot of these plants like to grow and look good with ornamental grasses. But if you're wanting to go sort of as edible as possible in the garden, the ornamental grasses don't really work out well. And I thought asparagus planted in singly or in small groups would give you that same look as ornamental grasses, while still being able to go and harvest the spears in the springtime. So I think it can really work double duty that way.
So far everything that you pulled milkweed.
Pretty much. Yarrows we aren't edible. The lady's mantle's not really an edible. It's more medicinal. And the milkweeds, yes. You don't eat milkweeds. The lady's mantle, no. That's not an edible one. Yeah. Another one that's more ornamental and has a more medicinal use, but I just love it, is the wild indigo. Wild indigo is a shrubby-like perennial, dies down to the ground in the spring, gets wonderful long spires of blue flowers in the early summer. After the bloom period, it becomes quite shrubby in its growth habit, and then when you grow it in mass, it turns black in the fall. It makes a great combination to the tans and golds of dying foliage of other plants through the winter. Now this is another super little plant that not a lot of people know about. This is Calamintha, or Nepetella as it's listed in Richter's catalog. You'll see it listed under that. Calamintha is a little mint relative. And if I say mint, I don't mean a mint that's going to be all over the garden, you know, in 3 weeks after planting. It actually stays put, has a wonderful minty taste to the leaves. You can use it as an edible mint if you want. But what I like to use it as is like that lady's mantle that we saw earlier. This is a great edger, filler, ground covery type plant. And it's another one of those perennials that once it starts blooming in the late spring, early summer, it will not stop until frost kills it in the winter, in the fall. In fact, this picture here was taken in late October, and it still is in full bloom as it was in June. Wonderful little plant, tidy, non-running, but it still has all those minty things you can use it for. And again, for the pollinators and honeybees, they love it. It only gets about a foot tall, so it's a real great edger, masser, ground covery type plant. Colors, lavendery blue or a white, sort of in that soft color tone. There's not a lot of different varieties of it out there, but it is excellent. There it is again with some liatris coming through it. So it's a great little mingler type plant. There's another patch of it there. right through here with some bee balm in the background, just to give you an idea. It is edible, yes. You can eat it and make tea with the leaves and things like that, for sure. It's very minty. It's very kind of a sweet kind of mint. Yeah. And because we can't really talk about attractive herbs without talking about Echinacea, even though it's not really an edible one except for when we're trying to get rid of colds and things. It is a fantastic perennial plant. Echinaceas love the full sun, fairly dryish, well-drained soil. They grow really well up here for us. In rich soils, they may not even live as long as they do in dry, more well-drained, more lean soils. And that's actually one thing that was discussed in this lecture I was at the other night. You know, when we're gardening, we're always told to, you know, get garden soil as rich as possible. You know, keep adding lots of goodness, and we sort of get to a point where we think we should be gardening in what amounts to potting soil in the garden. And for some plants, that's okay, but for the majority of plants, that's actually too much fertility. And you'll actually get better results with less fertility and sort of crummier soil if you want. And in fact, a lot of studies been done in Germany on that. And the best soil mix that the studies that were done in Germany found to grow perennials in was 90% gravel and 10% organic material. You know, and the Echinaceas, especially this one in the picture, kind of agrees with that. Because this is in our garden, and like I say, our garden, if it isn't sand, it's stones, and that's about it. This Echinacea has been in the exact same spot in the garden for 15 years. Whereas in many people's gardens, Echinacea may only live 5 or 6 years and then peter out. So we tend to keep our soil very lean. We keep the fertilizer away. It's a little bit different than what you think about normally. But anyway, Echinaceas are great plants, and there's been a ton of work, breeding work done with Echinaceas over the last few years. I'm sure if you've been in a garden center anywhere, you'll see them. We used to just have purple and white. Well, those purple and white Echinaceas were crossed with another species called Echinacea paradoxa, which has a yellow flower, and it gave us an orange Echinacea. And then further breeding now, we've got Echinaceas in all kinds of different colors, right from whites through pinks and reds, purples, yellows, all sorts of things. So there's lots of different variety out there now. Double flowers, really crazy double flowers. Not a real big fan of these ones, but they are interesting. I prefer sort of the more typical Echinacea flowers, but this is a particular one that I am kind of really smitten with at the moment. This is a variety called Hot Summer, and I like it because it changes. It comes out yellow, and then as the flowers age, it goes through different shades of orange to sort of a deep, sort of a sunset orangey purple color as the flowers go. So that's what I'm particularly fond of right now. But you know, they are attractive to pollinators. They certainly will bring pollinators into your garden. You're not going to use them for your salads or anything like that. But they are wonderful, showy perennials, blooming most of the summer and attracting the butterflies and things to your garden. And if you can match the butterflies to the flowers in your garden, you get extra bonus points. That just was a really... I didn't set that. He just happened to land on the monarch-colored Echinacea in the garden one day, and it was just happened to have my camera close by. It was perfect. There are other Echinaceas out there. Echinacea purpurea is certainly the most popular one. But from a medicinal standpoint, Echinacea pallida, this guy here, is the one that has more of the benefits from a herbal standpoint. And it's a really good, tough plant, too. Much narrower petals than Echinacea purpurea, and kind of droopy. There's a selection called hula dancer because they kind of hang like hula skirts, the flowers do. So it is even much more drought tolerant than the regular Echinacea purpurea as well. So if you've got really, really dry areas, this is an excellent plant for those situations. Now, one plant we probably all have lots of, or too much of, are the old-fashioned daylilies, or ditch lilies as we call them. This is a double-flowered form, which is a little bit more ornamental in the garden, but I've included them today because you may or may not know that every single part of the daylily is completely edible. You can eat the tubers, you can eat the new shoots, you can eat the flower buds, you can even eat the flower petals. So if you're one of those gardens that you're getting overrun with your ditch lilies, start eating them. It's probably the best way to keep them under control. But they are completely edible, the whole plant. And, you know, most daylilies do make good garden plants as well. You really can't go too wrong with daylilies. They're not my favorite, but they work. They're pretty easygoing. As long as they don't get too dry, they're no problem. Here they are with some of the Agastache in the background. Another plant we don't often see in the garden, not planted anyways, is this great froth of purple here. And this is the Dame's Rocket, or Hesperus matronalis. We usually see it in the late spring in roadside ditches and things like that. Sometimes we call it wild phlox, because it looks like summer phlox, but it's blooming in sort of late May, early June. That's Dame's Rocket, or Hesperus matronalis. It's a biennial. It does grow from seed and scattered through, you know, rough places. But I thought this was one of the best uses I've seen for it. This is combining it with the big giant allium ornamental onions. So they bloom right at the same time. And ornamental onions, if you've ever grown them, you know that the foliage dies and looks really crummy right when the flowers are coming into bloom. So the Dame's Rocket's a great filler, and it will hide all that dying allium foliage and be a nice complement to the plants. And as well, I didn't realize it, but yes, you can eat the young foliage and put it in salads and things like that. So if you happen to get too much, if it's reseeding around too much for you, pull up the young ones, leave a few where you want them to flower, and eat the rest. Now, another plant that has been around for a number of years, and I think Janine put one up here for us. It's a little one. This is a fun little plant. Has the common name of fish mint, which doesn't give you much for it there, but it's a very popular Vietnamese herb and vegetable where you use the leaves. It came out in the horticulture trade, this variety called chameleon, with this wonderful multicolored foliage, probably about 20 years ago. And we all got really, really excited about it until we had it in the garden for a year and realized that it was everywhere. It is one of those minty type things that will spread all over the place. So you have to watch it. It's very hardy, no problem, easy going. You can eat it if you get too much, but what we found a use for it is that it's actually an aquatic plant or semi-aquatic plant. So we grow it in pots and sink it in our little fish pond. And that keeps it contained, and we know where it is. It's got a ring of pond around it so it can't escape itself into the garden. It's a beautiful foliage plant, so if we want to use it, we use it in that way. Iris germanicus, the German irises or bearded iris. The old-fashioned form, the Florentina, is a white form, and it was used in making perfumes and things like that. We like to use them in the garden because, again, bearded iris will take our dry, sunny conditions. So we grow them in our soil quite well. The one problem that we have with the bearded iris is that the foliage is hideously ugly after it blooms. And ours are usually infected by a leaf spot, which just makes them look even worse. So what we do with them is we surround them with other late emerging perennials. Ornamental grasses, daylilies, late summer daisies, things like that. So we get nice flowering from our German iris, and then they sort of disappear into the background amongst all their late blooming plants. And lavenders. Lavenders are a great plant, and I know a lot of people will have trouble with lavenders. Lavenders for us, in our conditions up here, are a perfect plant. We have clumps of lavender in the garden that are pushing 25 years old now. They're absolutely fantastic because they need this kind of conditions that we have here. They want drainage. They don't want water sitting around them, particularly in the wintertime. You know, so often you'll see a gardener, and I experienced this a lot this past year working with a landscape design company. People want lavender. They edge their gardens with it. Then they put an irrigation system in, water it 3 times a week. Nothing will kill lavender quicker than wet feet like that. So we grow our lavenders very dry, very lean. Never irrigated, never fertilized, and they love it. As hot and dry as we can keep them. And for us, the English lavenders, Lavandula angustifolia, have been the best. There are a lot of different lavenders out there, but for general garden use, in our experience, the English lavenders have been the best. They survive every winter we've ever had. Okay? We've tried French lavenders and some of the hybrid lavenders, and they haven't done as well for us. We'll get them through a couple of years, and then we'll get a really harsh winter, and that'll do them in. If you want to grow those ones, we grow them as container plants, put them into the garage or something for the winter, treat them that way. But English lavenders are wonderful in the garden. We get fantastic results. There they are in the rock garden there. And there's the kind of conditions. This is a shot of our rock garden. So they're growing right along in very dry, gravelly soil with hardy cacti that we never irrigate as well. And they do perfectly great in those kind of conditions. A couple of plants I'd love to be able to grow, but have very, very limited success because, of course, they want the opposite end of the scale, are the lobelias. This is the great lobelia, Lobelia syphilitica, with spikes of blue flowers. And then one of my favorites, the Lobelia cardinalis, with the wonderful spikes of brilliant red flowers. They're not really edible plants, but they will attract pollinators and hummingbirds and things to the garden. And again, I know it's hard to see it, but bonus points if you can match your lawn furniture in the background to your flowers. Always makes a great combination. That wonderful red chair with their Lobelia cardinalis. But these guys grow in wet, swampy, boggy soil, even right on the edge of streams. And they like that kind of wetness. They don't live a long time. A couple of seasons usually is all they get, but then they reseed and will colonize in those situations. Another big favorite of mine, and we don't have the best soil for these here. They do prefer a little bit more richness, a little bit more moisture, are the Monardas, or bergamots, or bee balms. If you like Earl Grey tea, this is what you're drinking. It's the bergamot. Wonderful, fruity, minty sort of flavor and fragrance from the foliage, but excellent, hardy perennials. Some of the varieties can get a little rambunctious. They are a mint relative, so they will sort of, creep their way through the garden. So you need to keep an eye on that. But I love them for their summer flowers. Again, attracting lots of pollinators to the garden as well. One thing with the Monardas or bee balms is older varieties had the problem of powdery mildew on the leaves. And just when the plant started to look good and come into flower, they'd be attacked by powdery mildew and then look terrible. A lot of breeders have been working with Monardas for a number of years, and any of the newer varieties that are available now are almost mildew-free. I can't say they're 100% mildew-free, but they're a whole lot better than they used to be. So if you've got bee balm in your garden and you love it, but it sort of mildews and looks terrible, just rip it out, get yourself some of the newer selections, and they're much better that way. There it is there with some nepetas. This is purple rooster. Now also, most Monardas or bee balms are in sort of the 3 to 4 foot tall range. Pretty big, bold perennials. But again, a lot of breeding work has been taken on with these for a number of years now, and we're getting much more compact varieties that can work well in the smaller garden, in containers. areas where you don't have room for a 4-foot by 4-foot clump of bee balm. There's a few varieties out there now. These are two you're going to see a lot of probably in the garden centers this year because they're part of the Proven Winners range of perennials. This is Pardon Me Pink and Pardon Me Purple. The one nice thing about these dwarfer, more compact bee balms is they don't run the same as the bigger ones, but they still give you the same fragrance and the same foliage. You can use them just the same way, but they're more compact and maybe a little less maintenance in keeping the plants where you want them to be in the garden, and very mildew resistant. Now with those bee balms, they generally like the moist soil, but we do have one that's native to our area here, and it's one of my favorites. This is Monarda fistulosa. It's a nice lavender color, does not get mildew, no problems there, and it actually likes the drier soil. It doesn't run around like the red-flowered bee balms. And it's actually native to our area. This picture I took was across the road from the nursery on Brock Road last summer. So it's growing right in along the roadside ditch with the black-eyed Susans. And it's a wonderful perennial. Again, the honeybees love it. And it's a great combination plant to really break up a lot of those summer yellow daisies. In the summertime, we have a lot of yellow daisy-like flowers that pop up with the Rudbeckias and false sunflowers and all that sort of thing. So having that Monarda with that different flower shape and different flower color is a nice break from some of those yellow daisies. If you have trouble with lavenders and they're rotting away on you every winter, but you still want that look, then the Nepettellas or the Catmints are a really valuable group of perennials to look at. From an edible standpoint, no, they are very aromatic. You could use them in potpourris and things, but they're not really an edible herb. But they give you that lavender look. Long spires of mauve flowers, lavender blue flowers, depending on the variety. Nice silver foliage, and a very tidy habit. There are some that get quite tall. This is one of the most popular ones on the market right now, called Walker's Low. When it first came out, we sort of all thought it was going to be a dwarf plant by the name. And while it is low, only getting about 2 feet tall, it can still get about 4 or 5 feet across. So it's not a dwarf by any standpoint, but they really make a wonderful flowing edge and filler around big, tall perennials. Blooming in the early summer, cut them back lightly, they'll flush out with bloom again and be great. And when I said they're a good replacement for lavender, they will take much more moisture than the lavenders will, especially through the winter. Yeah?
How far down do you cut it?
It depends. You can just sort of take the flower stalks back if the plant's still tidy. If the plant's not tidy after its first flowering, you can cut it back really heavily, maybe even 4 inches or so, and let it flush out new growth from then. And it'll flush out a whole new crop of new foliage and give you a second crop of flowers. If these big guys are a little too big for you now, plant breeders have always coming up with new things. And this is Junior Walker. Junior Walker is about half the size of Walker's Low. So it's a nice, tidy, sort of foot by 18-inch tall mound of those lavender flowers. The oreganos. Oregano's a wonderful, very attractive plant. There are some forms out there that are more ornamental than others. This is one of my favorites. This is Oreganum Herrenhausen. And Herrenhausen's a German variety. Doesn't have quite the kick of the edible oreganos, but certainly can be used that way. What it does for us in the garden is it gives us a nice 1 to 1.5 foot tall mound of sort of rosy purple flowers in the mid to late summer. combines well with other perennials. There it is in a mass in a large garden, just to give you an idea. Another plant, and this one drives me crazy, and I'll explain why in a second. This is Russian sage. Russian sage is a wonderful silver leaf, almost a shrub, but we treat it more like a perennial because we cut it down to about 6 inches tall. The foliage is silver, very aromatic, can be used in potpourris and things like that, not really edible. Russian sage is not a great common name because it's not really a sage, and I don't even think it's from Russia. So, where it gets the common name, I don't really know, but makes a big cloud of wonderful blue flowers in the summer. What drives me crazy about it is, for some reason, in our dry sand, this plant will not grow. If I go a little bit further down the road, down Brock Road into Claremont, where the soil's starting to get a little heavier, they can grow it wonderfully. I see big, huge shrubs of it in gardens down there. But all I've ever been able to manage is a 4-inch little spike with a few leaves on it and maybe one flower. Really drives me crazy. But it's a beautiful plant. And great for that midsummer to late summer color. It's a nice frothy flower, so they blend in well with other perennials. There it is there. It's a little hard to see, but there it is there, underplanted with the ornamental oreganos, because you can do it that way and you can have it mingled in with other plants. Back into mint relatives. This is Pycnanthemum, or mountain mint. We're not going to get into regular mints today, because regular mints are crazy. I love them, but you don't want to plant them in the garden. But there are some relatives of the mints that can be used in the garden quite well. And the mountain mints are excellent filler type plants that run a little bit. They're going to spread around a bit, but not quite like mint does. Mountain mints have interesting flowers. The flowers are very, very tiny, so you really don't notice them. But what they have is they have bracts. You know how a poinsettia has big red flowers? Well, those aren't really flowers. Those are bracts. They're modified leaves that turn color to attract pollinators to the tiny little flowers. Mountain mints have the same sort of setup. They have these neat silvery leaves that surround the little tiny flowers that make a great sort of foil and filler in amongst your perennials. You can use them just like a mint, equally usable that way. And if you're attracting pollinators and honeybees to your garden, these are fantastic. They love the pollen that these produce, and you will always have bumblebees and things like that on them continuously all summer. I thought this was a great example of another edible, kind of like the asparagus that we always sort of relegate to a back corner of the yard and don't think about. This is a garden in Quebec, and it's in a very cold part. It's right on the north shore of St. Lawrence River, out near Quebec City. So it's very, very cold in the wintertime. And they were trying to replicate sort of the looks of gardens that they see in England and France and Italy and things like that. Places where they can grow great big bold leafy perennials that we can't grow in our climate. So what did they use? Instead of those big bold perennials, it's just rhubarb. Just plain regular rhubarb. Giving a great ornamental look of plants like gunneras and things that they can grow in the south of England that we can't grow here. So it's a great use of an edible plant. You can certainly harvest that in the spring early and then let it grow out and give you all the ornamental benefits of the big leafy plant, and still have harvested all the rhubarb stems in the early part of the year. Now, this is a bit of a mash-up here, but the plant we're looking at is down in the bottom corner here, and that's just a regular common garden sage, Salvia officinalis. We grow the selection called Burgarten. It's got a bigger leaf, rarely ever flowers, because we just want mounds of silver foliage. Yeah? No. All sages are perennials, but they're not all winter hardy. Let me put it that way. Because there are a lot of sages that you will get. Some of the really cool fruit sages and things like that are technically perennial plants that won't survive our winters. Okay, so those would come in. These guys here are fully hardy garden plants, so there's no problem with leaving them out in the garden year-round. With the Salvia Burgarten, we love it. We use it as an edge along the potager. We mix it in every year. We mix it in with curly parsley because they make a great combination. But it's a nice silvery leaf plant. You could use it as an edging. You could use it as sort of a sub-shrub in the rock garden if you wanted to, and then harvest the leaves as you need it. There are some different forms of the regular garden sage with gold leaves, a gold edge leaf, a purple leaf, and a purple and white variegated leaf. They're all slightly less winter hardy, but the regular silverleaf one is a good, solid, hardy perennial. And just out of thing, this is one sort of not maybe perennial that I'm just going to mention while we're right here. If you're not using curly parsley as a filler in your annual gardens or your containers, you should be. This frothy green all the way down this border at the Niagara Park School of Horticulture is just simply curly parsley. A great filler, and you just cut it and pick it and eat it as you need it. Parsley's a biennial, actually. So if you plant parsley this spring, it's going to grow all summer for you. You can harvest it all summer. It probably will overwinter, and then will flower next year. So you sort of, our parsley right now, when this snow melts, we'll be able to go out and harvest parsley, but we won't try to keep it all of the next year. So we sort of treat it as an annual with a bonus of being able to harvest it in the spring. Then you'd replant it, yes. Yeah. It really what it's going to do in the second year is just go to flower and produce seed. But like I say, we will get a nice crop of parsley this week coming, as soon as the snow melts away, because it's all right there. Yeah, but it's a great filler and very showy plant for your annual borders and things like that. Now back on the sages, there are lots of other sages available out there, mostly for a little more ornamental use. We see them very popular ones in the spring. We see Salvia May Night and Caradonna with wonderful spikes of violet blue flowers for the spring perennial border. But there are some that I like for the summer, and Salvia pratensis, the meadow clary, is one. And the reason why I like it is it's a little more loose and open in its growth habit than the typical perennial varieties you get at the garden center. It blooms a bit later, blooms through the summer, and because the flower stalks are not as stiff and upright as sort of the May Night type varieties, it mingles nicely. It'll weave its stems through other perennials and sort of pop up flowers here and there, and really mingles nicely in the perennial garden. Lamb's ears. We often think of lamb's ears as just being that woolly silver leaf plant. I think we've got a little bit. There's your typical lamb's ears there. And that's an excellent plant for edging and filler and that sort of thing as well. Kids love to touch it and pet it. But the Stachys densiflorus, or betony as it's called, is a wonderful flowering perennial, clump forming. The foliage is green, but it makes wonderful sort of foot-wide clumps with long-lasting purple flowers through the summer. And you can use the foliage. I forget what you use the foliage for. Koidu could tell you if she's here for sure. And the thymes. There are so many different varieties of thyme out there, and they're all great for the garden, especially if you've got good, well-drained soil. The taller, more culinary thymes, like English thyme and French thyme, that sort of thing, will get sort of 6-8 inches tall, and you can harvest and clip them. The thymes we like to use are the more lower creeping varieties that you can use sort of like lawn substitutes. And that's what's in this here. You can see right through here, this is two different varieties. Woolly thyme and mother of thyme there, both creeping varieties that lay basically flat to the ground. And you can use them as a lawn You can use them between stepping stones. And the nice thing about having a thyme lawn or thyme along your walk, every time you stroll along it, it releases the fragrance of the thyme as you're walking through the garden. It's wonderful. And it can be used as a lawn substitute. Well, we've got a few different varieties, and there are a lot of different varieties. Some of the more flat creeping ones that we like to use sort of in stepping areas and will take some foot traffic. We use the woolly thyme, which is a nice silvery leaf with a pink flower. There's mother of thyme, which is a green leaf with a more reddish pink flower. And there's about 10 or 12 other varieties. If you look through Richter's catalog there on the list, you'll see a ton of different varieties that can be used in that way. So that just gives you a bit of an idea. And it really works well. I know a gardener in Aurora who built a fragrant garden area in his garden. And what he did is he created a thyme lawn. He did it the cheap way. He went out and he bought 12 plants one year, planted them out, and then every year he just kept splitting them in half until he filled the yard. And then he had a wall-to-wall carpet of thyme to walk through in the fragrant garden. You can get a plug tray and do it a little quicker if you wanted to, but it is possible to do that because they just root as they layer. So they're very easygoing, and they will take some foot traffic. There's actually a garden on a couple of concessions over here, just south of Uxbridge, that I drive past every once in a while. And it's just a rough grass area, but what I think they did is a number of years ago is just seeded thyme into the grassy area. So all of a sudden, in the middle of summer, their lawn just turns into this haze of pink. But there's still grass growing there. So the thyme leaves are so tiny that you would never even notice, if they crept into somebody's lawn, except the fact that when they walked on their lawn, it smelled really nice, So I wouldn't worry about that sort of thing, because it's definitely doable as a lawn replacing ground cover. Yeah, for sure. And one last one for the sun. I know some people don't like the smell of it, but I like valerian. I like this fragrance. It's kind of a vanilla-y scent to me. It's probably wants more moisture than we can give it in the garden, and we always get some kind of bug that just after it flowers eats it to the ground, so it keeps it under control for us. But I do love the fragrance of it. I know some people don't. Another last one for the sun, the blue vervain, Verbena hastata. Another great filler-type perennial for summer color. I really like the way it's a tall, narrow plant, and it'll just come up through everything in the garden and just blend the garden together nicely. Now, just a handful for the shade. Not a lot of herbal-type plants for the shade, but there are a few. One of my favorites, Asarum canadense, the wild ginger, our native wild ginger. Not a ginger per se, but the root pieces can be used in place of ginger. In the garden, it makes a 6-inch tall ground cover in the shade. Big heart-shaped leaves. Sweet woodruff can be a little rambunctious for some, but it's wonderful, fragrant foliage and white flowers. And I just learned it just the other day that it's a main ingredient in a nice German drink in the springtime. I didn't know that until just last week. But the hosta. We all have hostas in the shade, but why are we going to include them today? Has anybody eaten their hostas? In Japan, they're a delicacy. They eat them quite regularly. And interestingly enough, if you look at plant families and things, hostas used to be in the lily family with daylilies and things like that. But botanists have done more research, and they've actually realized through a lot of their more recent research that hostas are actually in the same family as asparagus. And you eat the new shoots just like asparagus. Just the young shoots when they're coming out of the ground. You harvest them like asparagus, and they can be eaten. They can be steamed or boiled. They can be put into sushi, things like that. Some of the best varieties. Hosta Montana is one of the best varieties for that, apparently. I haven't tried it yet. I think I'm going to harvest some this spring, though, for sure, and give them a try. Another great plant for the shade garden, it's a wonderful perennial if you have dry shade, and that's the epimediums. Not many people know epimediums or use them in the garden, but if you have dry shade, it's a perennial you need to look for. Delicate flowers in the spring, wonderful foliage, especially when it emerges in the spring, more or less evergreen. There's the flowers there. It's kind of a slow perennial to propagate, and it's a little bit pricey, so I think that's why people don't see it used too much. Also, it has a terrible common name of barrenwort, which really doesn't help at all. And then just this past winter, I actually found another great common name for it, and it'll make everybody want to grow it because it's just fun. And that's called the horny goatweed. Because epimedium is actually quite widely used as an aphrodisiac in Chinese medicine. I didn't realize that. And when the goat herders and things, when the goats find this growing wild, they go crazy and they gobble it all up. So, and that's where it gets the name horny goatweed. So I think by then it's going to be a lot more popular now because of that. But it is an excellent ground cover for dry shade. One of the best plants for dry shade that you can get. Another plant, when I talked about coming up to the garden up here, and we've been up here for about 30 years now, but when we first started gardening, we couldn't grow ferns in our garden. It was just too dry. So one plant that we tried and worked well as a fern substitute for us from an ornamental standpoint was sweet cicely. Sweet cicely is a wonderful perennial herb. You can use the seeds. They're like licorice. You can use the leaves and the stems. It's an excellent culinary herb. Clusters of white flowers, but the foliage looks like a big fern. And while it will like full sun, it actually grows well in shadier areas for us. Here it is here right on the corner here. You can see its ferny foliage. It made a wonderful fern substitute for us until our soil was a bit richer in some areas that we could actually grow ferns. And then speaking of ferns, if you've got a damp area that's shady, your ostrich ferns or your fiddlehead ferns are great in those kind of conditions. We don't like to let this loose in the regular garden because it's a little bit vigorous. It does spread around by rhizomes, but where it can be left to romp around, it's a great fern in those kind of situations, and you can get a nice crop of fiddleheads off it in the springtime if you're quick and you happen to be there that day that the fiddleheads are ready to go. In this combination here is a nice big mass of symphytum or comfrey. Comfrey is used as a great herb. I'm sure there are books here that have a million uses for comfrey as animal feed and compost maker and all that sort of thing. It's a great plant. It's a bit vigorous again for the normal garden, but where you've got a damp out of the way area that you can let it fight it, duke it out with the ostrich fern, it's a great combination. Same with our native Mayaples. Great ground cover under shrubs and trees and things like that. Very attractive foliage when they emerge in the spring. And then nice white flowers sort of hiding underneath the foliage. And just lastly, one of my favorite perennials. It is a native, sort of. This is the bloodroot. Single bloodroot grows around here wild. Low creeping clumps of very unusual shaped foliage. White daisy flowers for a very short period of time in the spring. It's a wonderful herb for using for the dye because the roots, it's called bloodroot because the roots bleed like orange sap as soon as you break them, and you can use it for dyeing and things. This is the double flowered form, which looks like wonderful double water lily flowers in the spring. And it's just one of the treats of our early spring garden. So with that, I'll wrap it up. And if you have any questions, I'll happy to take them now. Yeah. When are we going to be open? Well, good question. We're not open daily anymore. You probably know that by now. We will be open at the nursery on Saturdays from April the 30th until I think it's the third Saturday in June. Then I'm going to be in England for a couple of weeks looking at gardens in England. And then we'll know summer hours. We'll decide sort of in June what we're going to do through the summer. But we'll be open Saturdays from April 30th till the third week of June. 10 till 4. Yeah. It's on the website, masonhousegardens.com. You can find all the open hours are all posted there now. So, yeah. Yeah, Sophie. Yeah, you know what? And I should have mentioned. I forgot all about it, but I didn't. You know, I didn't forget about it until I started. Richters grows a variety of chives here that's fantastic called Profusion. It's sterile. It doesn't set seed, so you don't have to worry about your chives reseeding. And I know Sophie has used it fantastically well as an edge to her rose gardens. So her rose garden is completely edged in a beautiful ribbon of chives. And it's the Profusion variety, so she doesn't have to worry about it reseeding. But it's equally as vigorous and everything else, and flowers and everything, but sterile, so it doesn't set seed. Oh, the sorrel, yes. I didn't talk about the sorrels, but that's another one. It's sterile too, right? Yeah. Anybody else have any questions? All right. Thank you very much.
At Richters, it's not just a garden, it's a whole new world. For herb plants, seeds, veggies, and more, visit us at richters.com or call 1-800-668-4372.